Good morning, Warsaw. Today is Friday, 22nd September. It will be slightly cloudy with highs of 15 degrees Celsius or 59 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 6:38 a.m. and sunset at 6:51 p.m. We are on the 53rd day of the Warsaw Uprising, and there's so many things happening. So what are they, Alina?
Yes, Philippe, there's always lots going on during the Warsaw Uprising. But again, I want to start today's episode by talking about two insurgents, a brother and a sister, Piotr Kodorski and his sister, Halina Kodorska, later after the war, Zacharska. And Halina and Piotr ended up in Warsaw during the occupation. Actually, they were there beforehand. Piotr managed to help Halina get a job at a chemist, and this is going to be important because during the occupation, she actually worked at the chemist's, and the two siblings were separated from their parents. Their parents were in territory that was absorbed by the Third Reich, so they didn't know if their parents were alive or dead, and they just had to carry on with life as it was. Piotr was married. He had a wife and two children. The young girl was born before the war broke out, and his son was born in 1943. Now, Piotr had already been working in the underground resistance, like many other people, like many other insurgents, and he pulled his sister into it as well. Halina also helped out the owners of the chemists because she worked there during the occupation. She was given a task to help bring food to Jews in the ghetto, and that's what she did. She would enter a house on the Aryan side that would border the ghetto, and she'd go up to the attic. From the ghetto, they would throw over a large board that she'd have to walk over, but she was so terrified of heights that she crawled over it instead. And she'd carry a large sack, and at the bottom of the sack, that's where she'd hide the food. On top, she'd hide it with various things like bags or knitting equipment and things like that. So if she did get stopped, the Germans would just see some random items and allow her to pass. And she was rarely stopped anyway. But this is obviously before the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which broke out in April of 1943. Up until then, she was bringing food over. But like I said, she was brought into the conspiracy by her brother Piotr, and they both joined obviously in the Warsaw Uprising. Piotr in the early days was separated from his unit. He wasn't sure if they'd survived, and he couldn't get across because the Germans were blocking his way. He couldn't get across to his unit. So he ended up going to his sisters, and together they joined another unit and fought together. Piotr, during the occupation, he was also a firefighter. And a couple of weeks into the Warsaw Uprising, he gets delivered some absolutely devastating news, because by this time, everybody, or at least they'd heard rumours, that whole families, whole buildings, and thousands of innocent civilians were murdered during the Wola massacre. That's the massacre we talked about on the 5th of August. So his whole family, meaning his wife and his two children, the youngest, which was only a year old, were murdered by Derlewanga's brigade in the Wola massacre. Now, he was delivered this devastating news, and there was nothing he could do, really, so he continued fighting in the Warsaw Uprising, and it was on this day that he was killed, and he was killed on Wielka Street. Wielka Street doesn't exist anymore. It was demolished as part of the project to build the Palace of Science and Culture. So Wielka Street, a street that just doesn't exist anymore in Warsaw. So it's on this day that he dies. However, his sister, Halina, she does survive the war, and she gets married to a man that she was in love with before the war. They get married, they have a son, and then she passes away in 2014. And she did leave her testimony in the Warsaw Uprising Museum, so if anybody's interested, you can always head over there and have a read more about her experiences. But let's talk about what's happening on the ground very, very quickly. So in Mokotów, the Germans are preparing for a general attack on the northern part of Mokotów. So the insurgents are having to strengthen their positions and preparing for artillery bombings and air bombardment. This is now where Mokotów is going to be targeted. That is because Czerniaków is more or less falling on this day. The last house on Solec Street falls on this day. And two of the commanders in the area decide to break through to the southern part of Śródmieście, southern part of the Midtown district. So whoever is left has moved to the next district, and we have seen this throughout the whole of the uprising, where the Germans attack one district, so the insurgents move to the next district. When that district falls, they move to the next district, they move to the next district, and they move to the next district. In Żoliborz, according to a situational report by Antoni Chruściel, who is in charge of the Warsaw Uprising, commanding the Warsaw Uprising, he states that the locations remain unchanged. Our troops are cut off from the River Vistula. Polish People's Republic has dug 2 rows of trenches on the Wisłostrada, one towards the Vistula and one towards our lines. There are constant Soviet airdrops which are strengthening our forces. I just want to add something to this. They're not really strengthening the forces. As we very well know, half of those are filled with sand or broken, come out without parachutes. The ammunition doesn't fit the weapons that the insurgents have. The food is rotting. It's useless, but I guess he's trying to keep the morales up of the other insurgents and commanders. He continues. Berling's 2nd Division is on the opposite side of the River Vistula. The 1st Battalion from Berling's divisions landed on the western bank of the River Vistula and hid in the reeds. They did not show any activity. Yesterday, the battalion was liquidated by the German Air Force. So, as we've very well spoke, Roger's spoken many times over the past couple of days about Berling's army, and they are not prepared, and they have no idea what the conditions are on this side of the River Vistula at all. But on the other hand, the Soviets, they're still sitting and watching Warsaw burn, occasionally throwing some artillery, occasionally throwing a little bit of air force. They're going to sit there till the 17th of January 1945. And the Warsaw Uprising ends in about 2 weeks' time. So you yourselves can see nearly 3 months they sit and wait for Warsaw to be completely and utterly destroyed before they enter a quote, which not fat chance that it's actually liberated, but apparently liberated. I don't know how you can liberate an empty city, but they liberate Warsaw. Anyway, what else is happening on the ground? Because even though there's a lot of military action happening, Claire, there's other things that are happening as well. Tell us a little bit about what's going on.
Well, just a bit of an update on plans for evacuation. I mean, everybody knows it's going to be impossible for the Polish insurgents to continue to hold out without at least a very significant change from Soviet policy. And so there are ongoing discussions about capitulation, about evacuation, on and off throughout this period now. And now at this point, the Home Army commanders at the Chernihiv Bridge section enter discussion to agree an evacuation date of that area with the Polish command of the 2nd Infantry Division, who are stationed in Praga. So this is planned for both the combatants in the area, but also largely the civilians sheltering in that area to get them out to safer territory. But unfortunately, things just fall apart immediately. The Germans continue to fire across the river, firing both rockets and grenade launchers, lighting up the Vistula. So as Roger was saying in an earlier episode about how they're not waiting to tackle these people on the ground, they're tackling them in transit. It's much easier to defeat your enemy if they're moving across a river. So you have boats, filled with civilians and the wounded trying to cross the Vistula under the belief that there is this evacuation window, and they're just getting hit with intense fire. The boats are going down, people are drowning. Very few of them, some do manage to return to the Chernihiv bank, but I think it's 94 people make it across to the Praga side of the Vistula. That is it. And then the German envoy proposes that the district capitulates and a ceasefire is finally agreed only for between 8 and 9 o'clock the next morning, during which civilians and the remaining injured are to be finally evacuated without being fired at en route. So, I mean, it's incredibly hard to trust anyone. These windows of opportunity come and go, and even when they're agreed, it seems they often fall through and you get the wounded and civilians being fired on. So these windows of evacuation are negotiated, but even then they often fall down. There is a complete breakdown of trust and protocol between the Polish insurgents and the Germans. And of course, there's very little trust with the Red Army, the Russians as well. Moscow, Roger, what's happening there?
Yeah, it's quite an interesting admission that comes out of a meeting between representative of the Polish Committee of National Liberation, which is otherwise known as the Lublin Committee, which was the sort of pro-communist proto-government that the Soviets have got ready to march into Warsaw when the time comes. One of their representatives, Stefan Jędrzejkowski, had a meeting with Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, in Moscow, and he reported back on that conversation to his fellow members at the Committee of National Liberation. And it's quite enlightening because it gives a sort of an inside track, if you like, on Kremlin thinking towards the rising, and particularly towards the question of airdrops and so on, and assistance to the insurgents. So what he says is, that essentially that the Soviet government in Moscow essentially considered airdrops to be ineffective. This came from Molotov's own words. Airdrops were ineffective. The only real help would for Warsaw and for the population would be the liberation of Warsaw by the Red Army. So, I mean, nothing particularly new there. Interestingly, Molotov also said that the aid that was being provided by the Soviet government was only really a sop or a concession to the Western Allies, who themselves believed in this form of aid as a way of assisting the insurgents. So he's admitting that they're not really terribly serious about assisting them. They're just going through the motions to sort of pacify the West, which is kind of interesting in the light of what we've been discussing over the previous days and weeks over this, that the huge amount of pressure.
How much do you think that's true? I mean, how much is... I think in this report, they actually say that continued airdrops would be giving the combatants false hope. How much do you think it would just have protracted the agony of what's happening in Warsaw at this point? I mean, obviously, the Soviets themselves could change things immediately by coming forward. They could advance right now, but they're not.
Yeah, but this late in the day, where, the rising is in its sort of final stages, then you could say there's some validity in that argument, that it is just prolonging the inevitable. Of course, that the assistance should have been given much earlier, in which at the opening week of the rising, then it could have been much more effective, much more useful. So there's an argument there, but bear in mind as well that the Soviets are they're not playing as honest brokers here. They're not haven't got the best interests of the insurgents at heart at all. They see the insurgents as, essentially in the same camp as the Nazis. They are opposing Soviet policy and the imposition of Soviet power. So, interestingly, even internally, they talk about how they don't think this is worth much. The airdrops are not worth much, and that it's really just a sop to sort of Western opinion and so on. But the bottom line is that they view the rising still as a sort of a reckless adventure by people whose aims are inimical to Soviet ambitions. So they're fundamentally opposed to it.
And had they really have, like you say, either airdrops much earlier or even enabling the Allies to land, refuel and so on in airfields held by the Soviets on the far side, would have made all the difference earlier on. But at this point, they're saying all this, but they're not moving. They're still pretty much based there waiting and watching. So, yeah.
Yes, exactly. And it's too late now to really make any difference is the point. But again, I think we have to, the suspicion perhaps might creep in that the Soviets are acting as honest brokers. They really aren't. They're fundamentally opposed to everything that the Rising wants to achieve.
Thank you so much for joining us for day 53. Please join us tomorrow for day 54. And remember, if you like us, please go rate us on your favourite listening platform. We do need those 5-star reviews to get our profile a little bit higher up. Thank you so much, and we'll see you tomorrow.